Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really captivating period.
Okay.
We're looking at India,
Right.
and specifically the decline of the Mughal Empire
Yeah.
and then the rise of British rule in India.
Right.
And I think for a lot of people, this is it's a really interesting story because it's one of those kind of classic how did a place, go from being ruled by one empire for so long to then
Hmm.
being taken over and ruled by, an empire across the world.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that makes this story so interesting is that it isn't just a simple, oh, the Mughals were in decline and then the British just kind of waltzed in and took over.
Yeah.
It's much more complicated. There were
Yeah.
all these other players, these autonomous states that emerged as the Mughals weakened. So it really is a fascinating story of, like you said, the decline of one empire, the rise of several others, and then ultimately the rise of the British.
Right. And, it really is a story of internal power struggles,
Absolutely.
but also these external pressures
Yes.
and then these like pivotal battles that really just change the course of history.
Yeah.
And for this one, we actually have we have maps, we have timelines, we even have some hand-drawn diagrams to kind of guide us through.
Fantastic. Yeah, those visual aids can really help to make sense of all the moving parts.
Yeah.
Because as you said, there are a lot of different players in this story.
Yeah. So before we get into, all the nitty-gritty, I think it's helpful to kind of set the stage.
Okay.
So let's transport ourselves back to the early 1500s, right? Imagine a descendant of Genghis Khan and Timur Babur, he conquers Delhi.
A powerful lineage.
Right. This is the beginning of the Mughal Empire.
Right.
But here's the thing about Babur. He wasn't just a conqueror.
Okay.
He was also a patron of the arts. He was really into this fusion of Persian and Indian cultures. So he wasn't just about conquest, he was about establishing something new.
Right. And I think that's something that often gets overlooked when we talk about empires.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they were built on conquest, but there are also often periods of great cultural blending and exchange.
Yeah, it wasn't just, imposing one culture over another. It was
Right.
about this fusion, this creation of something new.
Exactly. And the Mughals were masters of that. Think about the Taj Mahal, for example.
Right.
A stunning example of Mughal architecture that blends Persian, Islamic, and Indian influences.
And that's, a legacy that we still see today.
Absolutely.
But, every empire has its ups and downs, right?
Right. It's kind of the nature of empires, isn't it? They rise, they reach their peak, and then inevitably they face challenges and decline.
Exactly. And for the Mughals, well, their decline is a bit of a complex story.
Yeah.
But one of the key figures is Aurangzeb.
Oh, absolutely. Aurangzeb's reign is considered a pivotal one in the Mughal Empire's trajectory. He came to power in 1658.
Okay.
And his policies, compared to his predecessors like Akbar, were much more, shall we say, rigid.
Okay.
He reversed a lot of the religious tolerance policies that Akbar had put in place.
Like what?
For instance, he reinstated the jizya tax on non-Muslims.
Wow. And that was a tax that Akbar had actually abolished, right?
Exactly. And this really alienated a lot of people, particularly in the Hindu majority population.
Okay, so not just a religious decision, but a political one as well.
Precisely. And this is where things start to unravel a bit for the Mughals. Aurangzeb's policies, combined with his costly military campaigns, they put a huge strain on the empire's resources.
It sounds like he was spreading the empire thin.
That's a good way to put it. His reign was marked by territorial expansion, no doubt, but at a cost. And upon his death in 1707, the Mughal Empire, already weakened by internal conflicts and overstretched, began to fragment.
So it's like the glue that was holding everything together, it just started to come undone.
A very fitting analogy. And as the Mughal Empire weakened, a number of autonomous states, sensing an opportunity, began to assert their independence.
Right, and we see these new players emerge, like Bengal, right? This wealthy hub known for its textile production.
Right. Bengal was a real economic powerhouse.
Right, and then you have Mysore, led by Hyder Ali, and then later his son Tipu Sultan.
A formidable force to be reckoned with. Both Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan were brilliant military strategists.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. They modernized their armies and gave the British a run for their money, so to speak. But we'll get into that a bit later.
Okay, so we've got Bengal, we've got Mysore. Who else is vying for power during this time?
Well, you can't forget about Hyderabad, a center of Islamic learning and culture. It rose as a powerful entity in the Deccan region, further adding to the fragmentation of the Mughal Empire.
So it's like watching this game of chess where you suddenly have all these new players on the board.
That's a great way to put it. The once dominant Mughal Empire was now a shadow of its former self. And this shift in power, this fragmentation, it created the perfect opportunity for new players to enter the scene. Players from beyond the Indian subcontinent.
And those players, of course, were the European powers.
Precisely. Driven by their own ambitions and a thirst for trade and control, the Europeans, particularly the British, saw in India's fragmentation a chance to advance their own interests.
And that, I think, is where we'll pick up in our next deep dive. We'll explore the arrival of these European powers, their strategies, and their ultimate rise to dominance in India.
It's a fascinating and complex story, one that I think will resonate with our listeners even today.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper into the stories that shape our world.
The Mughal Empire was dealing with all this internal strife.
Yeah.
And across the world, Europe was undergoing its own transformations. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment had taken hold.
Right.
And with them came this insatiable curiosity for knowledge, exploration,
Right.
and, of course, trade.
Yeah. They were looking for new trade routes to the east. They wanted those spices. And
Yeah.
everybody knew that India, that was the source.
India was the prize, really. It held this allure, this mystique. And for centuries, the Europeans, they had relied on these land routes to get there. But those routes, they were long.
Oh, yeah.
And they were fraught with danger.
They were controlled by middlemen, too, so they were looking for another way.
Exactly. They needed a way to bypass those middlemen, to get to the source directly. And that's where Vasco da Gama comes in.
Oh, Vasco da Gama. Now there's a name that's synonymous with exploration, with adventure.
Right. In 1498, he successfully navigates a sea route to India.
Can you imagine that? I mean, setting sail into the unknown like that.
It is a monumental achievement.
It really was. And, his arrival in Calicut, it wasn't just about, planting a flag and saying, we were here.
No, it was a seismic shift. It ushered in a new era of European maritime dominance in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, and that's going to have huge implications for India.
Absolutely. Because where there's trade, as we know, there's often the ambition for control.
Always. And the Portuguese, they were the first ones in, so naturally they wanted to hold on to that advantage, to monopolize that spice trade.
Right. They established trading posts. They tried to exert their influence. But they weren't the only ones with their eyes on the prize.
No, they weren't. By 1600, you have the Dutch entering the fray. They set up shop in Calicut. And suddenly, it's a whole new ballgame.
Like a boxing ring with new contenders stepping in, each one vying for dominance.
And this is where things get really interesting, right? Because it's not just about the Portuguese and the Dutch anymore.
No, a new player emerges on the scene.
Yep.
And this one's going to change everything. The British East India Company arrives in 1602.
The British East India Company, it sounds almost innocuous, right? Like a trading company, just here to do business.
Right, but don't let the name fool you. While their initial focus was trade, their ambitions, they were far grander than that. They had a vision. They wanted control.
And they were very strategic about it. They sent ambassadors to the Mughal court,
Like Captain William Hawkins and Sir Thomas Roe.
trying to secure those all-important trading rights.
Exactly. And they were successful. They established trading posts. Factories, they called
The
them.
factories, it sounds so, I don't know, industrial.
Well, they were hubs of activity, centers of commerce. But they were also more than that. They were footholds.
Strategically placed, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Ah.
Surat, Madras, these were key locations. From these bases, the British, they could slowly, steadily expand their influence.
But they had a problem, didn't they? The Indians, they weren't really interested in buying British goods.
Ah, yes, the infamous trade imbalance.
They wanted those Indian textiles, the spices, but the British, they were having to pay for all of this with gold and silver.
It was draining their coffers.
And that's not a sustainable business model, is it?
Not in the long run. They needed to find a way to tip the scales in their favor. And they found it through diplomacy, of all things.
Diplomacy, huh? Tell me more.
Well, in 1717, John Sermon, he leads this mission to the Mughal court.
Okay.
And he secures this really important document, the Golden Farman.
The Golden Farman, what is it?
Think of it as a golden ticket.
Okay.
It granted the British East India Company duty-free trading privileges.
Wow, so they could trade without having to pay those hefty taxes. That's huge.
Oh, it was a game changer. Suddenly, they had this massive advantage over their rivals.
And did they stop there?
Would you, if you were in their position?
Probably not.
They also got Berkshire to grant them the use of Dosteks,
Dosteks, what are those?
duty-free passes.
So they could move goods around without any hassle.
Precisely. It was supposed to facilitate trade to make things run smoothly. But the British East India Company, being the shrewd operators that they were, they started to abuse this privilege.
Of course they did.
They started using the Dastaks for their personal gain.
Not just for company business.
Exactly. And this, as you can imagine, it didn't sit well with the local rulers.
Especially the Nawab of Bengal, right? Siraj-ud-Dowlah.
Exactly. He saw his revenues dwindling, his authority being undermined, and this misuse of the Dastaks, it just fueled the tension that was already simmering between the British and the Nawab.
And then, of course, you have the Black Hole tragedy.
Ah, yes, the Black Hole of Calcutta. A dark chapter. Now, the historical accuracy of what happened is still debated.
Right. Some say it was exaggerated by the British.
Possibly. But whether fact or fiction, it served a purpose.
It demonized Siraj-ud-Dowlah.
Precisely. It painted him as a tyrant, a monster, and it gave the British the justification they needed for a more aggressive approach.
It's almost like watching a play, isn't it?
It really is. You have all these different actors, each with their own motivations, their own desires, all colliding on this historical stage.
And the stakes couldn't be higher. I mean, we're talking about the fate of a nation here.
The fate of an empire, really. And the British East India Company, they were ready for their starring role.
Oh, yeah, they were not just traders anymore. They had a taste of power, and they wanted more. And what happens next is a series of battles that will really decide who controls India.
Battles that would reshape the political landscape. And one of the most pivotal, of course, is the Battle of Plassey in 1757. It wasn't just a military engagement, it was a strategic triumph.
Robert Clive, he was a master tactician, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Clive understood that to win in India, he couldn't just rely on brute force. He had to play the political game, exploit those existing divisions. And that's exactly what he did with Mir Jafar.
Mir Jafar, one of Siraj-ud-Dowlah's own commanders.
A man driven by ambition. And Clive, he played on that ambition, promised him the world, essentially.
And Mir Jafar took the bait. He betrayed Siraj-ud-Dowlah on the battlefield.
A betrayal that changed the course of history. The British, with their puppet ruler installed, they now controlled Bengal.
And Bengal, like we talked about before, was an economic powerhouse. So this is a huge victory for the British.
A turning point. From this point onward, their influence in India, it just grows. But it wasn't always smooth sailing.
Oh, I bet. You think Mir Jafar was happy playing the puppet?
Not for long. He wanted power, real power. And that led to another major confrontation, the Battle of Buxar in 1764.
Buxar, now this one sounds like it was a real clash of titans.
It was a truly multinational affair. You had Mir Qasim, who had replaced Mir Jafar as the Nawab of Bengal.
Okay.
And he wanted to break free from British control.
Right.
And then you had Shah Alam II, the Mughal Emperor. He was desperate to hold on to what little power he had left.
Right.
And then Shuja-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Awadh. He was trying to protect his own interest. They all joined forces against the British.
Wow, a real coalition of rivals, united against a common enemy.
Exactly. But despite their combined might, they were no match for the British.
And with this victory at Buxar, the British, they cement their dominance.
They had defeated the Mughals, the Nawabs. They had outmaneuvered their European rivals. They were now the dominant force in India. And to formalize this new reality, they imposed the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765.
The Treaty of Allahabad, what impact did that have?
It was a turning point. This wasn't just a peace agreement. It was a transfer of power on a massive scale. The British East India Company, they were granted the Durrani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa.
The Durrani. Now, remind me what that is again.
The right to collect land revenue. Essentially, the British, they now controlled the treasury of some of the most prosperous regions in India.
Wow, that is a bold power move.
It was a calculated move. With this treaty, the British East India Company, they transitioned from traders to rulers. But their ambitions didn't end there. They still faced challenges, rivals vying for control.
Like the French, right. I mean, they weren't just going to sit back and watch the British take over.
Exactly. The Carnatic Wars, a series of 3 conflicts between 1746 and 1763, they were all about the French and the British battling it out for supremacy.
So it's not just an Indian story anymore, it's global.
Absolutely. The Carnatic Wars, they were really a microcosm of the larger struggle for colonial dominance between European powers.
And in India, at least, the British come out on top.
They did, but their victory wasn't absolute, not yet. They still faced resistance, particularly in the south, from Mysore, ruled by Hyder Ali and his son, Tipu Sultan.
Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, I've heard those names. They were known for their military prowess, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. They were formidable opponents. They modernized their armies. They even used rockets in battle. Imagine that.
Rockets in the 18th century.
Yes, they were ahead of their time in many ways. And they gave the British a run for their money. Literally.
But in the end, Mysore falls.
It does. Tipu Sultan, he dies defending his capital in 1799.
Mm-hmm.
And with his death, the last major obstacle to British dominance in India, it's removed.
Wow. So the British, they've defeated the Mughals, they've outmaneuvered their European rivals, they've subdued the powerful kingdoms of the South. They're calling the shots now.
That's right. And they consolidated their power through a series of policies designed to weaken the remaining Indian states and bring them under British control.
Like the ring fence policy and the subsidiary alliance system.
Exactly. The ring fence policy, it was all about creating buffer zones around British territories, protecting them from potential enemies. And the subsidiary alliance system, it was a clever way of stripping Indian rulers of their autonomy, making them dependent on the British for protection.
It's classic divide and rule, isn't it? Weakening your opponents by turning them against each other.
A tried and tested strategy for imperial expansion. And by the mid-19th century, the British East India Company, they had gone from a humble trading company to the most powerful force in India. But their grip on power, well, it wasn't as firm as they thought.
Because in 1857, everything changes.
1857, the year of the Sepoy Mutiny, a rebellion that shook the foundations of British rule.
And it all started with a rifle cartridge.
It did. A seemingly insignificant change, the introduction of a new cartridge greased with animal fat. But this wasn't just about the cartridge.
It was about something much deeper.
Exactly. It was a symbol of British insensitivity, their disregard for Indian customs and beliefs. And it ignited a firestorm of resentment that had been simmering for decades.
And this resentment, this anger, it wasn't confined to the sepoys, the Indian soldiers, and the British Army. It spread like wildfire throughout India.
It became a people's rebellion,
Yeah.
a united front against British rule. And it took the British by surprise.
They had to bring in reinforcements to crush the rebellion.
They did, and the aftermath of the mutiny, it was brutal, but it also forced the British to rethink their entire approach to governing India.
Mm-hmm.
The East India Company, it was dissolved.
And India came under the direct control of the British crown.
The birth of the British Raj.
Yep.
That's a whole other story.
It really is. And I think what we've seen today is how this period, this transition from Mughal rule to British rule, it wasn't a simple changing of the guard. It was a complex, often messy process shaped by internal power struggles, external pressures, and these pivotal battles that really did change the course of history.
And it's a story that continues to resonate today.
It does, because it's a reminder that empires, no matter how powerful they may seem, they are not invincible. They can crumble, they can fall. And sometimes it's the smallest of things, a rifle cartridge, a trade dispute that can tip the scales and change the course of history. So the next time you're reading about history, don't just focus on the dates and the names. Think about the people, the choices they made, the forces that shaped their world. Because history, it's not just something that happened in the past. It's a story that's still being